Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the suburb redeemed and the end of the quarter-acre dream. Or perhaps is it our panel may have different views there, perhaps. My name is Professor Lee Godden. I teach and research in the Melbourne Law School. I am an environmental lawyer with particular interests in areas such as climate change, water and biodiversity. And I also, in the past, have taught areas such as planning law. So it's a great pleasure to chair a session such as this today, where climate change comes back to where we live. And so I think it's a crucial panel and a crucial ideas that we will be exploring here today. And the focus will be on an integrating panel where we seek to involve you, the audience, as well as hear from our panel speakers. What I will do is introduce each of our distinguished panel as they come to speak in more detail, but now I'd just like to introduce Dr. Peter Kristoff, Professor Philip Goad and Associate Professor Andrew May. And what we will do, as I said, is we'll have a general panel presentation and it will be followed by a discussion. And we have a number of points of view being put by our panel members, and I will develop some points for discussion at the end of that series of presentations. We'll draw on the panel and then we'll throw it open to a moderated discussion. Can I ask, though, that your questions, when we do get to that point, be fairly brief and to the point, please, because we have a limited time frame today. Okay, I think without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, and that's Dr. Peter Kristoff. Peter has a long background in areas of environment. He teaches environmental policy and climate policy at the University of Melbourne. I had great pleasure to liaise with Peter in his climate law subject when I was the Director of the Office for Environmental Programs. His was one of the most popular subjects in that program, so he has a long-standing interest in this area, and he is a member of the Faculty of Land and Environment here in the university. He's also a member of the Premier's Climate Reference Group here in Victoria and the Victorian Ministerial Reference Council on Climate Change Adaptation. In addition, as if all those qualifications and experience weren't enough, he is Vice President of the Australian Conservation Foundation and formerly an Assistant Commissioner for the Environment, and wrote the first two State of the Environment reports in the 1980s, late 1980s and the 1990s. So, thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Lee, for that very generous introduction, ladies and gentlemen. I thought it might be appropriate to at least apologise at the start for not being an architect or an urban planner. As Lee said, I am someone who works in the area of climate policy and environmental policy. So inevitably, policy is going to be where this brief talk will come to rest. I think it's also fair to say that there's a theme that's going to run through this talk, and it's basically about chickens coming home to roost. And I'll explain how this works as we go on. But I want to make three broad points, if I may, through this very brief talk. Firstly, I think that there's a need to revalue and restore the suburbs as a site of production. Secondly, the intensifying pressures of climate change make this a real necessity. And thirdly, if we're going to achieve this change, we're going to have to challenge and address deeply entrenched institutional inadequacies and failures. I grew up in a suburb in Camberwell in the early 60s, in one of those Spanish mission-style houses on a quarter-acre block. We had fruit trees, apples, oranges, lemons, quinces, plums. We had the remains of a vegetable bed, which I assiduously refused to manage, despite my father's best intentions. Almost behind our house was the Gray's place. They had a chook shed, kept us awake, used mainly for eggs. And next door was Giordano's house. I can't remember Giordano's family surname. They were Italians from Trieste. And they're the only other migrants, apart from my family, for miles around as far as we could tell. Their backyard was this exemplary cornucopia of vegetables: tomatoes, carrots, potatoes, runner beans, zucchinis, cucumbers, whatever you could imagine. It's the sort of suburb that was well memorialised by the photographer Domenico Cozzolino in his photograph, Dad Checking Onions. By the time my family had left Camberwell in the 1980s, our part of the suburb at least had become a bit of a wilderness. The villa flats had taken over, 4 to a block. They'd surrounded us. There was concrete everywhere. The chooks and the veggies had pretty much gone. The sort of self-reliant or semi-self-reliant productivity of the suburbs, which had once been very highly valued, as was the collective action required to make this so, seemed to be in decline. Now, I've got to make it very clear to you that I'm not promoting an over-romanticised idyll of scrabbling chooks, the single milk cow, the ever-present whiff of dung. But I think the point I want to make is that since about the mid-20th century, Australia's suburbs have been converted from productive landscapes more into dormitory suburbs, especially but not only in terms of food. And the further you go out, in terms of the new suburbs, the more I think this seems to be the case. Now again, I don't want to overstate this conversion. In Andrea Gaynor's very fine book, Harvest of the Suburbs, she points out that even in 1992, which is the last bit of data that she and I could find, half the households in Melbourne and Adelaide still produced food of some kind, and about 5% were self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables. But again, in 1992, the last bit of data available to us, home production was pretty much dominated by an elderly generation, those born between 1923 and 1937, the Depression generation. By the way, ethnicity was not a factor if you happen to come from Northcote and look at the Italian and Greek gardens out that way. Now, this broad conversion, I think, has to be understood in the context of a series of complex changes in economic and social relations. We've seen over the last 50 years in particular the creation of long, fragile and probably highly unsustainable chains of production and consumption, which have provided cheap and easy access to a very wide range of goods and services as part of that phenomenon of increasingly globalised industrialisation. So in the area of energy, we've seen the development of perhaps, I think, unrealistically cheap power drawn from distant, concentrated points of generation. And that, of course, in the Australian context, is the use of our abundant and also highly problematic sources of coal. We've seen water drawn from increasingly distant catchments, from within the Yarra catchment initially, then from the Thomson. Now we're talking about the pipeline project with all the controversies associated with that. And in terms of food, we've had the evolution of a global farm. Australia now imports, I think, something like $8 billion worth of food, and the rate of increase in the value, at least, of that importation is really quite alarming or interesting. In any case, I think it's fair to say, at least from my analytical standpoint, looking at climate change and its implications, that these large-scale, highly concentrated and spatially distant solutions to our demands as urbanists are no longer as attractive as before. They're generally expensive, they're usually pretty profligate in terms of energy, and they are prone to failure. Large dams, big power stations, industrialised food and other goods and services produced elsewhere and transported from afar. So let me now talk about the suburbs in terms of the climate challenge and why I think that we need to return to increasingly productive localised landscapes, a partial retreat, if you like, to the suburbs. And I think I'd like to say that there are 5 reasons at least that one could talk about. These are interrelated sources of insecurity. Firstly, and this is really the overarching one, there's climate insecurity, the sort of issues that have been brought to us, and I think brought home to us very tragically early this year, in terms of the extremes of weather, extremes of heat, with the impacts on health, on transport, on demands of energy, on rainfall, changes in the longer term in sea levels, again with impacts on coastal suburbs, and also now very highly concentrated where it would be sewerage farm. If one looks at the recent study by CSIRO looking at temperature increases, projected increases for Melbourne, just Melbourne alone, we notice that, again in terms of these extremes, that by the time you get to 2070, with a moderate sort of pattern of emissions reduction occurring, we'll see temperatures in Melbourne over 30 degrees go from something like 30 days of over 30 degrees Celsius to about 39 days, or even up to 50 days if emissions continue to rise at a fairly unbridled pace. The number of days over 40 degrees, and this year has been quite exceptional, on average 1 per year, through to about at least 5 by the time we get to 2070. So there are significant demands going to be put on all of these systems. Then there's the issue of, let me just, again, so this is a general trend that we can see looking at the long trajectories, both in terms of rainfall and also in temperature increase. patterns of change. Then more immediately and more, I think, immediately in a cultural sense as well, we know that we are suffering from significant water insecurity, partly because of the ways in which we provide or supply for water. There have been significant changes over the last few decades in rainfall patterns. This is just an indication of the last few years, but you'll notice that the reddest area are the areas of lowest rainfall on record. And the same sort of pattern goes back for about a decade or so. This, of course, has had some implications for water availability. And as we know, again, very painfully in the Victorian and the Melburnian context, there's a significant decline in inflows to our various dams and various catchments. Then there's the issue of energy security more generally. In a climate of emissions reduction need, what sort of power will we have for the future? There's a very significant reliance, as we know, on coal in Australia, in Victoria in particular. We have the problem of how we're going to transform ourselves, generate energy from different sources, and also fuels from different sources for transport. I mentioned that there are increased demands for cooling in particular. Now, the general patterns of consumption leave us with a range of forms of insecurity. I want to tie into this discussion the insecurity that comes from the prospect of peak oil, pressure associated with the likely increases in cost and availability of oil, the growing scarcity over time of oil, including for transport, but also for agriculture and for manufacturing of various manufacturing activities and goods, which will have significant cost impacts unless effective substitution isn't found in time. And then lastly, and importantly, I think there's the issue of food security or food insecurity. We are vulnerable both in terms of climate and also supply, and also in relation to the cost pressures associated with water and transport for the reasons I've already mentioned. So broadly and in all, climate change is putting us under significant pressure, and our suburbs as well, in two particular ways. Firstly, there's the pressure associated with mitigation, emissions reduction. The pace with which we need to cut our emissions is severe indeed. It's about 40% by 2020, and well ahead of the sort of targets which are currently being discussed at the moment at Copenhagen, if we are to take seriously the prospects of dangerous climate change and limit our temperature increase to 2 degrees or even less globally, and close to 100% by, I think, well before 2050. So there's the mitigation problem. There's also the problem of adaptation. We're going to need to adapt to climate change if things go well. Climate is changing, there are pressures, and we'll certainly have to adapt if things don't go well in terms of emissions reductions. When you look at Australia in particular, we have built in over the last decades a very inflexible system of development, infrastructural development, in particular in relation to energy. And we've, of course, in the last decade suffered a very severe form of policy neglect in relation to energy supply and emissions provision. The point I want to make about this particular graph, which is a very complicated one, is firstly, half of our greenhouse emissions come from the provision of power, electricity, and the use of coal, and about another 14% come from transport. But of that combination, it's fair to say that about a third, somewhere between 30 and 40%, come from the cities overall. So overall, we are challenged very substantially by this infrastructural problem, the rigidity of our infrastructures. There's also the compression of time that we need to confront, the urgency of action to reduce our emissions, and in an emissions-constrained world, we have to find ways of changing our behaviour without throwing more resources at these particular problems. So, global warming compounds existing problems and causes a multiplicity of new ones. Few are amenable to a simple spatial solution, but cities nevertheless, because of their size, their configuration and their role in consumption, are both a source of threat but also the potential site for solutions. So how we live, and how we live in the suburbs in particular, matters a great deal. We're faced with the tyrannies of infrastructure and institutional and policy path dependency. We have to overcome the things that we have built over many decades. But first, let me talk about some solutions before we become too depressed. As I mentioned, we are built ourselves around a system of water security, drawing water from distant catchments, which are at the moment pretty much in some degree of decline or a problem. Others have suggested, and here I'm beginning to draw on some of the work done by the Victorian Eco Innovations Laboratory, a very interesting program run through Melbourne University. There are alternatives, for example, black water mining, sewer mining, or the retention of urban runoff, a much more localised form of water harvesting. Similarly, we are dependent on distant forms of energy and very much on coal. And yet it is possible to conceive of us transforming our cities and our suburbs to become sites of production. using geothermal perhaps for baseload, but also using solar and wind to provide us with those very important sources of peak energy which we're going to need to deal with. And similarly, when it comes to food, we can actually think about transforming our cities into what I think are well known as edible landscapes. We can transform those highly concretised and sealed suburbs into things which are much more productive and much more localised, and of course saving on energy costs associated with transport at the same time. The entire city, in fact, can be reconfigured as a result. So overall, I think that the possibility of an alternative way of conceiving the city is this. We can think of the city as a site of diversity, dispersed production, providing us with greater resilience in distributed and localised systems. And in this sense, a retreat to the suburbs, refashioned socially and ecologically, is a good bet. So, what next? Greater urban density? Probably, and I think that Rob Adams' very important work here needs to be thought about in the situation of working within a constrained environment, constrained energy, constrained time. All of this is going to imply significant changes in cultural, economic and regulatory behaviour. Commodified forms of production and consumption will need to be transformed. We'll have different forms of transport. We'll have different forms of employment. Having said all of that, I think it's now time to face some harsh realities, because so far, to date, we have a heritage of institutional and policy failure in the urban domain. We're not lacking in good words, the flurry of I words in terms of ideas, invocations, incantations. But the freeway, if you like, the freeway to the ever-expanding suburbs is littered with the roadkill of good intentions, good reports and even better plans. We've got a litany of planning failures which have marked Melbourne's and other Australian cities' development, and astonishingly, relatively little analysis of why this is so, little restraint, why we've had so little restraint on urban expansion or on population growth. So at the end of the day, I think we actually need to think about a festival implementation. This is where the chickens come back in again. Our chickens are going to come home to roost. The question we have to make, or the question we have to think about, is whether they'll be headless, or roasted, or regulated, or free range. We're confronted by the tyrannies of infrastructural, institutional and policy dependency and the limitations of our political systems. State governments in particular are too close to the action, in my view, too reliant on political client groups and deeply compromised as a result. So we need not only new ideas but new institutions and new funding. Admittedly, we're seeing new funding for solar power, for public transport, but this is still vastly offset by vastly greater funding for developments that entrench, for a very long period to come, high energy fossil fuel use and emissions and the problems of climate change. So far, we've not seen the move towards integrative and adaptive and nimble institutions, ones which will tie government departments and development activities together across the silos of energy and transport and housing and food and water production and also emissions reduction. There's not that integration there, and it's critically important. In terms of regulatory and planning controls, and planning is a state responsibility, we haven't seen enough brilliant innovation here. Green tracking regulations which will provide very, very quick permits to those developers who want to go to 8 or 10-star housing or building developments, and transport planning standards. I also believe that we need much more powerful federal regulatory and fiscal intervention, both in terms of coordination and funding. Perhaps going back to something, and some of you may shudder to hear this, the DIRD, the Department of Urban and Regional Development style development or approach which was used by the Whitlam government many decades ago. We need federal fiscal intervention to provide both carrots and sticks. The proposed state infrastructure tax is not going to be a sufficient barrier to poor development. Ironically, the carbon pollution reduction scheme which the government is talking about is going to allocate some $20 billion over the first 5 years of its operation to support high-emitting industries. That $20 billion should be used to rebuild our suburbs, to integrate these processes that I'm mentioning, and to recognise that cheap and affordable housing is a political driver and an economic driver for governments and politics generally. We need cheap, equitable, energy-efficient housing and probably infill as well. And this is perhaps the way that we need to think about the suburbs into the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I think that was a wonderful sketch through a range of patterns of drivers in relation to policy development. And I'd now like to turn to our second speaker, who can very nicely perhaps give us some insight into the interstices of those patterns and policy developments that Peter sketched out for us in talking very directly about building design and planning design. And so it's with great pleasure that I turn to our second speaker, Professor Philip Goad. He is the Director of the Melbourne School of Design here at the University and an authority on Australian architecture, and is internationally known for his research in this field. And he brings a wealth of different sorts of expertise. He's both an architect, a conservation consultant, and a curator, as well as being an expert on the life of Robin Boyd. He has a number of publications and award-winning publications to his credit. In particular, he's the author of New Directions in Australian Architecture and the co-author of New Directions in Tropical Asian Architecture. So it's really interesting to see different cultural perspectives also coming to bear, and that is something that I think might be very interesting if we can pick up, given that the festival is also about the idea of cultural change. In 2006, Philip was a co-recipient of an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant for a 2-year study on healthy bodies, healthy minds, designing everyday modernism for Australian communities, 1920 to 1970. And with that, I'd like to ask Philip to come to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for that introduction. For years, the Australian suburb has been alternately loved and reviled, the subject of dismal novels and searing social critique, the subject of black humour and grim realism, sentimentalised and lampooned, enshrined or simply cast out. There have been critics and commentators like George Johnston, Patrick White and John Brack, but also champions like Hugh Stretton, Patrick Troy, and architects like Edmund and Corrigan in the late 1970s and early 1980s, who controversially celebrated the ugly and ordinary of the suburbs as a place where dignity could be found in the ordinary. In painting, perhaps no one has captured this ambivalence as well as the late Howard Arkley in his luminescent, fuzzy portrayals of the icon of suburbia, the single-family house. But there's now a pressing need to reimagine the suburbs. Our cities cannot afford to keep spreading. Infinite sprawl is no longer tenable, especially when there is not the transport and services infrastructure to support growth, nor the provision of public facilities and public landscapes to create viable communities. We've tried to reimagine parts of the city before, and this image might be familiar. The results were frankly dramatic. The Housing Commission towers that ring metropolitan Melbourne were too damaging in their argument for urban change, and yet they were undertaken with the sincere aim of social reform. And despite their obvious flaws and shortcomings, one can argue strongly that there were and still are many positive aspects to these schemes. Increased density, the provision of affordable housing, the proximity to public transport, the proximity to shopping streets and also markets, a resistance to gentrification, and the retention of a broad social and diverse ethnic mix in inner urban neighbourhoods. Now, the problem and success of the suburbs has been the resilience of the suburban ideal. And after all, what's wrong with it? A picturesquely planned single-family house with a garden. It's got home ownership, privacy, it's a veritable and manageable Arcadia. But in today's terms, one has to ask, and really I support Peter in this, can we still afford this in terms of space, energy usage and water consumption? And does this housing form really reflect the demographic mix and needs of today's society? Now, for years we've thought that this was the case, despite the naysayers and also despite the clear and obvious presence of higher density housing types in all Australian capital cities since the 1920s. And it's been supported by writers like Robin Boyd, whose 1952 book, Australia's Home, reprinted for decades and supported by a swathe of home magazines and speculative home builders marching to the horizon, all repeating the catch cry that Australia is the small house. Well, it's not anymore. and we need to wake up to the fact that our suburbs need to address the concept of density. It simply doesn't make sense to think that only the central city can support high-density residential living. It's a reality that suburbs like Camberwell will have a skyscraper or two in the future, and that's okay. At Camberwell Junction, this is the approved development, which will rise to 15 stories. It will replace an ugly car yard, retain an historic bank, and have mixed use of shops and restaurants at ground level. But clearly, it doesn't spell the end of Camberwell and its leafy residential enclave. It doesn't raise an area of historic houses or despoil an historic streetscape. But interestingly, it doesn't contain a compulsory percentage of affordable housing. But it does mean that Melbourne might begin to think of itself as a series of urban villages. It was always founded as a series of villages, but why not a series of urban villages with nodes of, and I'd suggest we might have to think of, nodes of high density. Frankston, Box Hill, Ringwood, and yes, why not Camberwell? This, it has to be said, is one of the cornerstones of the plan of Melbourne 2030, a much discussed and, in some quarters, vilified plan, but a plan which was intended to actually try to halt the infinite sprawl of Melbourne. And politically, we know already, if you listen to the radio this morning, things are changing with the boundaries to our cities. But even this notion of density has to be supported by public transport and community infrastructure, supporting this idea of Melbourne being a series of urban villages. What this all means is that urban designers, planners, architects, landscape architects and developers should be rethinking the fundamental unit of the suburban subdivision, the block, and closely examining density and matching it against the continuing and dominant desire for living on the ground, having a garden and, where possible, affirming private home ownership. Density and volumetric studies like these might be a way of making change, but at a level of incremental and organic change, as opposed to the dramatic tabula rasa projects of the 1960s. We need to think of doing this carefully and in a way which actually doesn't compromise amenity. Why not, for example, consider a different housing type? Density studies such as these reveal the efficiency of the Courtyard house as a new urban model. So why not look at the ancient Roman Courtyard house on the left, which generally had two totally private courtyards, one of which was an impluvium. And the impluvium collected rainwater that was fed directly into a subterranean water tank. So why not? History has so many really interesting, denser housing types which we can think about. Or on the right, what of the traditional Chinese courtyard house? Again, a house with at least two courtyards, which employed clay bricks and clay roof tiles, materials all familiar to us, and which connected to the hutong, a pedestrian-based lane network outside. And why not? Why not think of these as different ways of thinking about houses? We don't need it to immediately jump to the idea that increased density means high-rise apartment living. It's no surprise then that in Melbourne in the 1950s, the most progressive architects, when they built for themselves, designed courtyard houses. Roy Grounds' Courtyard of 1953 for his house in Hill Street in Toorak was a circle covered by a canopy of deciduous vines, the focus of all the rooms of this two-bedroom house, while all windows to the outside walls were above eye height. Robin Boyd's house in South Yarra was another courtyard house, this time a brilliant rethinking of the 19th century terrace house separating parent zone from children's zone, but it could easily be two households, one on either side of the courtyard and sharing the space between, an idea of a cooperatively shared suburban garden. But it's not just the house as a typology that needs to be reimagined. And I must stress that I've just shown just one of a myriad of possible solutions to rethinking housing type.